There's a moment in every person's life when they realize they've been running in the wrong direction, and by the time they turn around, everything they loved is already gone. Today's story is about a man who had everything: success, wealth, respect, but refused to surrender the one thing God was asking for until it was almost too late. Before we begin, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever waited too long to trust God with something important. This is a story that will make you question what you're holding on to right now that you should be letting go. His name was Marcus Webb, and at 42 years old, he stood at the top of his industry as one of the most successful real estate developers on the East Coast, with projects spanning from Boston to Miami, each one more ambitious than the last. He'd built his empire from nothing, starting with a single duplex he'd renovated with his own hands 20 years earlier, working 16-hour days while his wife Elena waited at home with their newborn daughter. People admired his work ethic, his vision, his ability to turn forgotten neighborhoods into thriving communities. But what they didn't see was the cost. The missed birthdays, the broken promises, the Sunday mornings he chose job sites over church pews. Elena had been patient for years, praying quietly at the kitchen table while Marcus reviewed blueprints, asking him gently if maybe they could slow down, if maybe they had enough, if maybe it was time to focus on what really mattered. But Marcus always had one more deal to close, one more property to acquire, one more project that would finally be the last one, the one that would let him rest. He'd grown up poor in rural Alabama, watching his father work 3 jobs and still lose their house to foreclosure, and he'd made a promise to himself that his children would never know that kind of fear, that kind of powerlessness, that kind of shame. So he worked and he built and he acquired, ignoring the quiet voice in his spirit that whispered during those rare moments of stillness, the voice that asked him what he was really building and whether any of it would matter when his time came. Elena would leave Bible verses on sticky notes around the house. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul? And Marcus would pocket them without reading, telling himself he'd think about spiritual things later, after this next deal, after this next year. His daughter Sarah was 17 now, brilliant and beautiful, accepted to every college she'd applied to, and Marcus barely knew her anymore, couldn't remember the last real conversation they'd had that wasn't about tuition payments or career planning. She'd stopped asking him to come to her soccer games years ago, stopped waiting up when he came home late, stopped expecting him to be present for anything that mattered, and the distance between them had grown into a canyon he didn't know how to cross. Elena tried to bridge the gap, tried to keep the family connected, but even she was growing tired, her prayers becoming more desperate, her patience wearing thin after 2 decades of coming second to concrete and steel. Marcus told himself it was all for them. Every missed moment was an investment in their future. Every sacrifice was actually love in disguise, but deep down he knew he was lying to himself. And then came the deal that would change everything. A massive waterfront development project in Charleston, the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime, $60 million in projected revenue if he could just secure the financing and the permits. Marcus threw himself into it completely, spending weeks in Charleston, missing Sarah's graduation, missing his 20th wedding anniversary, missing the signs that his family was falling apart without him. Elena called him one night while he was reviewing contracts in his hotel room, her voice shaking, telling him they needed to talk, that she couldn't do this anymore, that she'd been praying for guidance and she thought maybe they needed some time apart. Marcus barely heard her, distracted by an email from his attorney about a zoning issue, promising they'd talk when he got home, not understanding that this was the moment, the crucial turning point, the last chance to choose differently. He closed the Charleston deal on a Thursday, celebrated alone in his hotel room with expensive scotch, and drove home Friday evening planning to surprise Elena with the good news, imagining her pride, her relief that the sacrifice had been worth it. But when he pulled into the driveway of their colonial house in the suburbs, Elena's car was gone, and there was a note on the kitchen table written in her careful handwriting, explaining that she'd taken Sarah and gone to her sister's house in Virginia for a while, that she needed space to think and pray, that she loved him but couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore. Marcus stood in the empty house he'd bought but never really lived in, surrounded by expensive furniture and achievement plaques, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt the full weight of what he'd been running from. The fear, the emptiness, the realization that he'd been building monuments to his own insecurity instead of a life worth living. He tried calling Elena repeatedly that weekend, leaving voicemails that started apologetic and ended defensive, his pride warring with his panic, but she didn't answer, and Sarah's phone went straight to voicemail every time. On Sunday morning, Marcus found himself driving to the church they used to attend as a family, the small congregation where Elena still served on the prayer team, though he hadn't been inside in over 5 years. He sat in the back pew during the service, uncomfortable in his designer suit among people in casual clothes, listening to a sermon about the rich young ruler who'd walked away from Jesus because he couldn't let go of his possessions. The pastor, an older man named Reverend Matthews, whom Marcus vaguely remembered from years ago, spoke about how God sometimes has to pry our fingers off the things we're clinging to because we're holding on to weights instead of treasures, drowning ourselves with the very things we think are keeping us afloat. After the service, Marcus sat in his car in the parking lot for an hour, watching families leave together, children holding their parents' hands, and something broke open inside his chest. A dam of emotion he'd been holding back for decades. He drove to his office instead of going home, climbed the stairs to his corner suite on the 20th floor, stood at the window overlooking the city skyline, and finally prayed for the first time in years, though he didn't really know how anymore. His prayer was clumsy and desperate, part confession and part negotiation, asking God to fix his marriage while promising he'd try to be better, try to be more present, try to balance things differently, still not understanding that God wasn't asking for better time management but for complete surrender, for trust, for faith. Monday morning, Marcus called his business partner David and suggested they might need to slow down on new acquisitions, focus on stabilizing their current projects, and David looked at him like he'd suggested burning money, reminded him about the 3 new deals they were negotiating, the investors who were counting on them, the momentum they'd built. Marcus backed down immediately, his resolve crumbling under the weight of expectations and obligations, telling himself he'd make changes after these next projects closed, after things settled down, after the busy season ended. He texted Elena that night, promising to come visit in Virginia that weekend, promising they'd talk about everything, but she responded with a single sentence: "I need you to be different, not just promise to be different." The words hit him like a physical blow, but still he didn't understand what she was really asking for, what God had been asking for all along. 3 weeks passed in a blur of meetings and negotiations, Marcus working even harder to distract himself from the emptiness of his house, from the silence where his family used to be. He'd call Elena every few days, have stilted conversations where they both tried to sound normal, where she'd ask about his health and he'd ask about Sarah's college preparations, both of them dancing around the real issues, the deep wounds, the fundamental questions about what kind of life they wanted to build together or if they could build anything at all anymore. Sarah refused to talk to him at first, her anger still too raw, but eventually she took his calls and her words cut deeper than Elena's silence ever could, asking why he'd bothered having a family if he was just going to ignore them, asking if his buildings loved him back, asking if he even knew who she was anymore beyond her college acceptance letters and grade point average. Then came the audit notice from the IRS, routine they said, but Marcus's accountant called sounding worried, mentioning some irregularities in how they'd structured the Charleston deal, nothing illegal necessarily but aggressive tax strategies that might not hold up under scrutiny. The stress began affecting Marcus's sleep, his health, and one morning he woke up with chest pains and ended up in the emergency room where doctors ran tests and told him his blood pressure was dangerously high, his stress levels through the roof, his body showing signs of chronic exhaustion. Lying in that hospital bed attached to monitors, Marcus finally began to understand what Elena had been trying to tell him for years, that he was killing himself chasing security, that he was so afraid of ending up like his father that he'd become someone worse, someone who had everything and nothing at the same time. He called Reverend Matthews from the hospital, surprised when the pastor answered and even more surprised when Matthews said he'd been praying for Marcus specifically, had felt led to pray for him every morning for the past month without knowing why. They talked for over an hour, Marcus confessing everything. His fears, his pride, his inability to trust that God would provide if he loosened his grip on his empire, his terror that if he slowed down he'd lose everything he'd built. Matthews listened patiently, and then said something that would echo in Marcus's mind for days afterward. "Marcus, God doesn't want your success. He wants your surrender. And the longer you wait to give him what he's asking for, the more painful the lessons become, because he loves you too much to let you destroy yourself." The words were gentle but devastating, and Marcus knew they were true, had probably always known they were true, but knowing and acting are different things. The doctors released him with strict orders to reduce stress, change his diet, exercise regularly. basically rebuild his entire lifestyle, and Marcus drove home to his empty house feeling like a stranger in his own life. He walked through rooms that had never really been lived in, looked at photos of family vacations he'd been too distracted to enjoy, found Sarah's childhood drawings still pinned to a bulletin board in the kitchen, where Elena had put them years ago, hoping he'd notice. That night, Marcus knelt beside his bed for the first time since childhood and prayed differently, not asking God to fix things his way but asking what God wanted, what he was supposed to let go of, what surrender actually looked like beyond just working fewer hours or taking more vacations. And in the silence that followed, an answer came, not in words but in a deep knowing that shook him to his core. God was asking for all of it. The empire, the reputation, the control, the carefully constructed identity he'd built to protect himself from ever being poor and powerless again. It wasn't about being less busy. It was about trusting that he was loved and provided for not because of what he built but simply because he was a child of God, and that everything he'd been grasping for was already his if he could just open his hands and receive it. The realization terrified Marcus more than any business deal ever had, because it meant admitting that all his success hadn't made him safe, hadn't healed his wounds, hadn't filled the void he'd been running from since childhood, when he'd watched his father cry over foreclosure papers at the kitchen table. Trusting God meant believing he could let go without falling, could be vulnerable without being destroyed, could admit he'd been wrong without losing his worth, and those were risks that felt bigger than any financial gamble he'd ever taken. For 3 days Marcus wrestled with it, the decision consuming him, and he realized this was his Gethsemane moment, his own garden where he had to choose between his will and God's will, between the life he'd built on fear and the life God was offering through faith. He made lists of pros and cons, ran financial projections, calculated exactly how much he could scale back without losing everything, trying to negotiate a middle ground where he could trust God partially while still maintaining some control, but every compromise felt hollow, every half measure inadequate. Elena called on the third day to tell him she'd decided to stay in Virginia through the summer, that Sarah would leave for college from there, that maybe they should talk to a lawyer about formalizing the separation, and her words landed like a death sentence, the final consequence of waiting too long to trust what God had been asking for all along. That's when Marcus finally broke completely, the dam of pride and fear and stubborn independence shattering under the weight of losing everything that actually mattered while clinging to things that didn't matter at all. He called his business partner David and told him he was stepping back, transitioning to a limited advisory role, selling his majority stake in the company, and David responded with anger and confusion, accusing him of abandoning their dream, betraying their partnership, losing his mind. Marcus let him vent and then said something he never thought he'd say. "It was never our dream, David. It was my fear pretending to be a dream, and I'm choosing my family over my portfolio, choosing faith over control, choosing to trust that God will provide even if I stop striving." David hung up on him, and Marcus sat in the silence knowing he just set fire to his professional reputation. That word would spread through the industry that Marcus Webb had cracked under pressure, had a breakdown, lost his edge. But something strange happened as Marcus began the process of actually letting go. Instead of the terror he expected, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced since he was young, before fear had calcified into obsession, before success had become a trap instead of a blessing. He met with attorneys and accountants to structure his exit from the company, took meetings where longtime colleagues looked at him with pity or confusion, fielded calls from investors who wanted to understand why he was giving up right when they were positioned for exponential growth. To all of them, Marcus gave the same answer. He'd been building the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, and now he was choosing to build differently, to invest in what would last eternally instead of what would eventually crumble into dust. And if they couldn't understand that, he couldn't make them. The process took weeks, the legal and financial complexities of untangling himself from 20 years of business deals requiring patience he had to ask God for every morning because his instinct was to rush, to control, to manage every detail instead of trusting that surrendering didn't mean being irresponsible. He set up trusts for Sarah's education, ensured Elena would be financially secure regardless of what happened to their marriage, established modest but sustainable passive income streams that would support a simpler lifestyle, all while feeling the constant pull to hedge his bets, to keep a bigger safety net, to not go quite this far in letting go. But every time he was tempted to pull back, he'd remember Elena's voice saying, "I need you to be different, not just promise to be different." And he'd push through the fear, sign the papers, release the control, trust the process. During this time, Marcus started meeting with Reverend Matthews weekly, sitting in the pastor's cluttered office drinking bad coffee and talking about faith and surrender and what it means to die to yourself so you can actually live. Matthews shared his own story of almost losing his family to ministry workaholism decades earlier. How God had humbled him through a season of forced rest after a heart attack. How he'd learned that God wasn't impressed by his exhaustion and sacrifice but wanted his heart, his presence, his authentic broken self rather than his polished ministerial performance. The parallels to Marcus's situation were obvious, but what struck Marcus most was Matthews's honesty about how hard it had been, how many times he'd wanted to go back to the familiar patterns, how trust was something you had to choose every single day, not just once in a moment of crisis. 6 weeks after Marcus began the process of letting go, he drove to Virginia unannounced, showing up at Elena's sister's house on a Saturday morning with no agenda other than being present, being honest, being the man he should have been all along rather than the man he'd been pretending to be. Elena came to the door surprised, guarded, tired, looking in a way that broke his heart because he knew he'd put that exhaustion there, had worn her down with years of broken promises and misplaced priorities. They sat on the porch while Sarah stayed inside, Elena listening as Marcus told her everything. About the business he was leaving, the money he was walking away from, the identity he was releasing, the fear he was facing, the faith he was choosing even though it terrified him because he'd realized too late that she'd been right about everything, that she'd been trying to save him from himself for years while he'd been too proud and blind to listen. Elena cried as he talked, years of pain and hope and disappointment pouring out, asking him why it had taken losing everything for him to finally hear what she'd been saying, why he'd waited until she was gone to finally choose differently, why it always had to come to this kind of crisis before men like him would surrender. Marcus had no good answer except to say he'd been too afraid, too convinced that control was safety and that trust was weakness, too damaged by his childhood to believe that God could actually be a good father who provides and protects without requiring him to strive and perform and earn his keep. He told her about his hospital visit, about the conversation with Reverend Matthews, about the moment he'd finally understood that trusting God too late was still better than never trusting God at all, even if the consequences of his delay would mark them all forever. They talked for hours, Elena asking hard questions about whether this change was real or just another promise that would dissolve under pressure. Marcus answering as honestly as he could while acknowledging he'd broken her trust so many times that words wouldn't be enough, that only sustained action over months and years would prove whether his surrender was genuine. Sarah eventually joined them on the porch, angry and hopeful and skeptical all at once, 17 years old and already wise enough to know that change is easier to talk about than to live, that her father's pattern of choosing work over family had roots that went deeper than busy schedules and bad time management. She asked Marcus point-blank if he was really different or just scared of being alone, if he actually wanted them or just wanted to not fail at marriage the way his father had failed at finances, and Marcus appreciated the brutal honesty even as it gutted him. He told Sarah the truth, that he was both different and scared, that he genuinely wanted them but was also terrified of the emptiness he'd discovered in himself, that his motives were probably mixed but his commitment to change was real, that he couldn't promise perfection but could promise presence, could promise to keep choosing them over his fear every single day even when it was hard. Sarah studied him for a long moment, her mother's eyes in her young face, and then asked the question that mattered most. "Dad, are you doing this for us or for you?" Marcus thought carefully before answering. "Both, sweetheart, because I'm learning that I can't actually love you well if I don't trust God first. Can't be present for you if I'm not present with Him. Can't give you what I don't have myself, and what I've been missing is faith that I'm enough without the empire, that we're provided for without my striving, that trust isn't weakness but the greatest strength." Elena didn't agree to come home that day, told Marcus she needed more time to see if his actions matched his words, to pray about whether God was releasing her to try again or releasing her to move forward separately, and Marcus accepted her answer with a grace that would have been impossible for him months earlier. He drove back to his empty house that evening understanding that some consequences can't be immediately undone, that trust broken over decades takes time to rebuild, that choosing God doesn't guarantee instant restoration but does guarantee His presence through whatever comes next. The uncertainty was uncomfortable but not unbearable, held up by a faith that was new and fragile but growing stronger each day as Marcus learned to pray without demanding outcomes, to surrender without controlling the process, to trust that God's timing was better than his timing even when God's timing felt painfully slow. Over the following months, Marcus rebuilt his life on a completely different foundation. attending church not just on Sundays but participating in a men's small group where he was honest about his struggles, reading books about healing childhood wounds and learning healthy masculinity, meeting with a Christian counselor to address the fear and shame that had driven his workaholism for so long. He got a job as a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, work that used his skills but didn't define his identity, that paid enough but didn't consume his life, that let him be home for dinner and present on weekends and available when people needed him. His former colleagues thought he'd lost his mind, taking such a step down, earning a fraction of what he used to make, but Marcus experienced a peace he'd never known during his years of success, a lightness that came from living aligned with his values instead of running from his fears. He drove to Virginia every other weekend to see Elena and Sarah, taking them to dinner or going for walks or simply sitting together without agenda, learning who they'd become during the years he'd been too busy to notice, hearing their stories and dreams and fears without trying to fix or manage or solve everything. Sarah left for college in August, and Marcus was there to help her move into her dorm, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs alongside other fathers while Elena watched with an expression he couldn't quite read. Part hope, part caution, part recognition that the man helping their daughter unpack was someone she'd been praying would emerge for 20 years. That night, after Sarah's roommate arrived and they said their goodbyes, Elena asked Marcus if he wanted to get coffee, and they drove to a quiet cafe where she told him she'd been praying about their marriage and felt like maybe God was opening a door. Not back to what they'd had, but forward to something new built on better foundation. They started marriage counseling that fall, weekly sessions where they worked through years of hurt and disappointment and miscommunication, learning to speak honestly about their needs and fears instead of retreating into familiar patterns of avoiding conflict. It was harder than Marcus expected, this work of rebuilding intimacy and trust, requiring vulnerability that felt terrifying after spending decades behind walls of busyness and achievement. There were setbacks and difficult conversations and moments when both of them wondered if the damage was too deep to heal. But they kept showing up, kept praying together, kept choosing to trust that God could redeem even their broken story if they let him. Marcus learned that surrender wasn't a one-time decision but a daily practice, that trusting God meant trusting his work in Elena's heart too, meant not rushing her healing or demanding forgiveness on his timeline but honoring her process with patience he had to ask for every morning. By Christmas, Elena had moved back home on a trial basis, wanting to see how they functioned together in daily life, whether Marcus's changes were sustainable or would crumble under the pressure of ordinary stresses and routines. It was awkward at first, both of them overly polite like strangers living together, navigating shared space after months of separation, learning new patterns and boundaries and ways of communicating. But slowly, tentatively, they began rebuilding. Cooking meals together, taking evening walks, sitting side by side reading on weekends, attending church as a couple again where people welcomed them back with knowing looks and gentle prayers. Sarah came home for winter break and observed them carefully, still guarded but softening as she watched her father actually be present, actually participate in family life, actually choose them consistently over work and achievement and the siren call of significance through success. Marcus's life looked nothing like it had a year earlier. Smaller house after they sold the colonial and downsized, simpler lifestyle without the expensive trappings of wealth, quieter days without the constant pressure and striving and chasing. His old business partner David wouldn't speak to him, seeing Marcus's exit as betrayal, and most of his former colleagues had written him off as someone who'd had a breakdown and couldn't handle the pressure. But Marcus had something now that all his previous success had never given him. Peace that came from living aligned with his values, joy that came from being present for moments that mattered, intimacy that came from letting people see his brokenness instead of hiding behind achievement, faith that came from daily choosing to trust that God would provide even when he couldn't see the path ahead. He'd learned the hard way that trusting God too late still means suffering consequences that might have been avoided, still means living with scars from years of wrong choices, still means rebuilding what should never have been broken in the first place. But he'd also learned that too late is different than never, that God's grace meets us even in our delayed obedience, that surrender at 42 is still surrender even if it should have happened at 32 or 22, that redemption is possible even when the road is longer and harder because of our stubbornness. One evening in early spring, sitting on their porch with Elena while sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus asked if she thought they would have made it if he'd never lost everything, if he'd kept the business and found some middle ground of being less busy without fully surrendering. Elena considered the question for a long time before answering. I don't think you could have chosen differently until the cost of not choosing became unbearable. And I'm learning to make peace with that. Learning that sometimes God has to let us lose everything we're clutching before we'll open our hands to receive what He's offering. Learning that His timing isn't always our timing, but it's always redemptive if we'll trust Him through it. Today, 3 years after that crisis point when Marcus almost lost everything, his life is still smaller and quieter than it used to be, but it's fuller in ways that matter more than the size of his bank account or the prestige of his title or the scope of his projects. Sarah calls him regularly from college, actually wanting to talk to him now, sharing her life because he's proven himself trustworthy through consistent presence rather than grand promises. Elena smiles more, the exhaustion gone from her eyes. Their marriage rebuilt on foundation of mutual surrender to God rather than Marcus's compulsive control. And Marcus himself has learned that trusting God isn't about perfect timing but about eventually choosing faith over fear, that delayed obedience is still obedience, that God's grace is big enough to redeem even our stubborn wandering if we'll finally let go of what we're holding and reach for His hand. The story of what happens when you trust God too late is this: you suffer consequences that might have been avoided, you carry scars that mark your delay, but you also discover that God's mercy is new every morning, that it's never truly too late while you're still breathing, and that surrender, whenever it comes, is always the doorway to the life you were actually meant to live all along.